History doesn't always get it right the first time. In fact, some of the people we've spent centuries calling monsters may have been something far more complicated than that, and the ones who decided what we call them, well, they had their own reasons for choosing that word. If you've ever questioned a story you were told growing up, or wondered why the winning side always seems to write such a clean history, then this one is for you. We're going to spend the next several minutes sitting with three of history's most condemned figures and asking a question that rarely gets asked. What if we've been wrong? Not entirely, not in a way that erases real suffering, but wrong enough that it matters. Wrong enough that it changes how we understand power, legacy, and the stories we inherit without ever asking for them. If that kind of history is something you find yourself drawn to, consider staying with this channel. There's a lot more where this is coming from, and it only gets deeper from here. Let's start somewhere. Most of us think we already know the answer. Let's start with Vlad the Impaler. The name alone carries centuries of dread. Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, born around 1428 in what is now Romania, has become so thoroughly folded into the mythology of Dracula that many people have stopped thinking of him as a person at all. He has become a symbol of cruelty, of sadism, of something almost inhuman. The image most people carry is the one popularized in German pamphlets printed in the 1470s and 1480s, woodcuts showing a man dining peacefully among forests of impaled bodies, wearing a serene expression while people died around him. It is a haunting image. It was also, in large part, a political weapon. To understand who Vlad actually was, you have to understand where he came from. Wallachia in the 15th century was not a stable kingdom surrounded by friendly neighbors. It was a small principality caught between two of the most powerful forces in the known world, the Ottoman Empire expanding from the south, and the Kingdom of Hungary pressing from the north and west. Vlad spent his childhood as a political hostage. His father, trying to maintain a fragile peace with the Ottomans, surrendered young Vlad and his brother Radu to the Sultan as collateral for a promise. Vlad lived in Ottoman captivity for years, learning their language, their military strategies, and perhaps also learning something about how power works when it is held over someone's head. When he eventually returned to rule Wallachia, he inherited a principality in chaos. The boyars, the local nobility, had become accustomed to shifting loyalties, betraying rulers, and accumulating power at the expense of stable governance. Vlad had watched his own father be assassinated and his older brother buried alive by these same political forces. He came to power knowing that mercy, at least as traditionally practiced, had not served the people before him particularly well. The impalement that made him infamous was real. There is no erasing that. Vlad used it as a deterrent, a spectacle of consequence for those who broke his laws or betrayed his rule. Accounts from the time suggest he used it against Ottoman prisoners, against corrupt officials, against those convicted of theft, and against the foreign merchants who violated trade agreements at the expense of his people. None of that is pleasant, but context changes what it means. Public execution in medieval Europe was not exceptional, it was standard. What made Vlad unusual wasn't the act itself, but the scale and the particular method, and more importantly, the people who decided to document it. The German pamphlets that cemented his reputation were printed in cities with strong commercial and political ties to Hungary. Hungary and Wallachia were frequently in conflict. Matthias Corvinus, the king of Hungary, actually imprisoned Vlad for over a decade at one point and needed a narrative to justify it. Those woodcuts, those horrifying printed stories of monstrous cruelty, circulated through a Europe that was terrified of Ottoman expansion and hungry for a villain that wasn't Catholic. Vlad was a convenient monster. He was Eastern, Orthodox, brutal in a way that felt foreign, and he was already in a dungeon, so he couldn't exactly correct the record himself. Within Wallachia, the folk memory of Vlad was markedly different for centuries. Stories circulated there too, but in those versions, he was often the prince who brought order to a lawless land, who made it safe to travel, who punished the corrupt and the cruel. Neither portrait is complete, but only one of them crossed borders and survived into the modern imagination. And it's worth asking why. The story of Vlad leads us, almost naturally, into a broader question about how reputation crosses borders and survives the people who are meant to carry it. Which brings us to a figure whose legacy has been shaped not by woodcuts or pamphlets, but by something even more powerful: centuries of religious, political, and cultural narrative. Her name is Catherine de' Medici, and she has been called, depending on who you read, either the most dangerous woman in French history or one of its most unfairly maligned rulers. Catherine was born in Florence in 1519 into the famous Medici banking dynasty. She married Henry II of France at 14, an arranged marriage as was custom, and spent the early years of her marriage in a court that openly preferred her husband's mistress, Diane de Poitiers, over her. Catherine endured, she learned, she watched. When Henry died in the jousting accident in 1559, leaving her a widow with 4 young children and a fractured kingdom, Catherine stepped into the role of regent with a political intelligence that many around her had spent years underestimating. France in the second half of the 16th century was tearing itself apart over religion. The wars of religion between French Catholics and Protestant Huguenots were not simply theological disputes, they were political conflicts, fueled by powerful noble families who used faith as a banner for ambition. Catherine, who was Catholic, tried for years to hold a middle ground. She issued edicts of toleration for Huguenots at a time when toleration was not a popular position. She negotiated marriages and alliances across religious lines. She understood, perhaps better than anyone around her, that a kingdom that burned itself apart over doctrine would not survive to argue about it. And then came August 1572. The saint did. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, a wave of targeted killings of Huguenot leaders that began in Paris and spread across France, has followed Catherine's name ever since. Thousands died. The question of how much Catherine ordered, enabled, or simply failed to stop has been argued by historians for 450 years, and the honest answer is that no one fully agrees. What is clear is that the initial plan involved a much smaller, more targeted action against specific Huguenot military leaders, that Catherine knew of it, and that what followed spiraled far beyond anything she had sanctioned. The mob violence that consumed Paris in those days was not directed by a queen. It fed on decades of fear and hatred that no single person had created. But Catherine became the symbol of it. Protestant writers across Europe needed a face for the massacre, and a Catholic queen, foreign-born Italian, a Medici no less, surrounded by whispers of poison and sorcery that had followed her since her arrival in France, was a perfect candidate. The Black Legend of Catherine de' Medici was written largely by her enemies, and it was written to serve a purpose: to delegitimize French Catholic power, to rally Protestant resistance, and to make one woman carry the weight of a century's worth of sectarian violence. What gets lost in that legend is the quieter record. Catherine corresponded with scholars, patronized the arts, built portions of the Louvre, and spent 30 years trying to prevent the complete collapse of the Valois dynasty. She outlived 4 of her children. She governed under conditions that would have broken most rulers of her era. She was imperfect, politically ruthless at times, and she made choices that caused real harm. But the version of her that history handed down, the poisoner, the scheming foreigner, the architect of massacre, says as much about her enemy's storytelling as it does about her actions. There is a pattern here. Not a conspiracy, but something almost worse. A habit. A habit that power has always had of writing defeat into the bodies of the people it defeats, and writing evil into the names of those who threaten it. That habit becomes most visible when we look at a figure who stands in a category almost entirely alone in terms of how thoroughly history has flattened him into a single image. His name was Genghis Khan. Few names in human history carry the weight that his does. The Mongol conquests of the 13th century resulted in tens of millions of deaths. Estimates range enormously, but the scale of destruction was genuine and vast. Cities were leveled. Populations were massacred. Trade routes that had existed for centuries were rerouted or erased entirely. There is no reasonable way to stand before that record and call it anything other than devastating. And yet, Temujin, the man who would become Genghis Khan, was born around 1162 into a world of almost incomprehensible violence. The Mongolian steppe was not a peaceful landscape waiting to be conquered. It was a place of constant tribal warfare, raiding, kidnapping, and blood feuds that passed from generation to generation without resolution. Temujin's father was poisoned by a rival tribe when Temujin was a child. His family was abandoned by their own clan and left to survive alone on the steppe. He was captured and enslaved as a young man. His wife was kidnapped. He clawed his way out of every one of these circumstances, not through inheritance or privilege, but through intelligence, loyalty building, and a fierce adaptability. What he built was not simply an empire of violence. The Mongol Empire under Genghis Khan and his successors created one of the most sophisticated administrative systems of the medieval world. The Yam postal relay system connected thousands of miles of empire with a communication network that rivaled anything in Europe or the Middle East at the time. Genghis Khan codified law in the Yasa, which among other things guaranteed religious freedom across the empire, a policy strikingly unusual for its era. Merchants could travel from China to Persia with a degree of safety that had not existed before and would not exist again for centuries. The period known as the Pax Mongolica opened trade routes that eventually made possible the early exchanges between East and West that preceded the Renaissance. None of this cancels the massacres. The destruction of cities like Merv, Nishapur, and Baghdad, the deaths of scholars, the burning of libraries, the erasure of populations that had no military quarrel with the Mongols. Those things happened, and they should not be softened. But Genghis Khan's historical image has been shaped almost entirely by the cultures he defeated and the descendants of the people he conquered. The Persian, Chinese, and Islamic chronicles that form the backbone of what most Westerners know about the Mongols were written by people who had every reason to portray him in the darkest possible terms. They were not wrong about the violence, but they were also not neutral. What's interesting is that among the peoples who became part of the Mongol Empire, who were not on the receiving end of its initial conquests, the memory of Genghis Khan was often one of order, fairness, and protection. In Mongolia today, he is remembered as a founding father, not without complexity, but with genuine respect. History, again, wrote two different stories about the same man, and the one that traveled furthest was the one written by those with the most ink and the most grief. This brings us to something that quietly runs through all three of these lives. Through Vlad's prison years and the pamphlets that followed him, through Catherine's Italian origins and the fires that burned around her, through the ruins of cities and the trade routes built between them, what runs through all of it is the question of who gets to tell the story and what they need the story to do. Every era has its villains, and every villain was, to someone, also something else. A protector, a reformer, a survivor who went too far, a leader who made choices that history, looking backward from safety, finds easy to condemn. That is not the same as saying all choices are equal. It is not the same as forgiving what should not be forgiven. It is simply the observation that the line between monster and misunderstood is often drawn not by evidence, but by who controls the pen. The power of narrative is something historians have grappled with for as long as there have been historians. The ancient Greeks understood it, medieval chroniclers understood it, and the people who wrote those German pamphlets, those Protestant tracts, those Persian elegies absolutely understood it. They knew that the story you tell about your enemy is a weapon, and that a weapon used well enough, long enough across enough generations, becomes indistinguishable from the truth. We inherit those weapons. We grow up with them. We are taught them in schools. We see them reflected in films and novels and offhand cultural references, and we rarely stop to ask how they got there. The figure of Dracula began with a real man who probably would not recognize himself in the cape. The wicked Italian queen of French legend was, in part, a grieving mother who governed through impossible decades. The great destroyer of civilizations was also, in certain corners of the world, a man who freed serfs and opened roads and decreed that no one in his empire should be persecuted for what they believed. None of this is comfortable. Comfort is not really what history owes us. What it owes us is honesty, and honesty in history is hard because history is made of stories, and stories are made by people who had reasons for telling them the way they did. If you found yourself thinking during this documentary about a figure we didn't mention, someone from your own studies or reading who seemed in the conventional telling too simple, too convenient, too perfectly evil, we'd genuinely love to know who that is. Leave their name in the comments and tell us why you think history may have gotten them wrong. These conversations are some of the most valuable ones this community has, and the answers are often surprising. And if you know someone who loves history, who thinks carefully about the past and questions what they were taught, consider passing this along to them. These are exactly the kinds of conversations worth having together. History is not a verdict. It's an argument, one that never fully closes, one that every generation inherits and has the right to reopen. The next time you hear someone described as a monster, as a tyrant, as the villain of their era, it might be worth pausing for just a moment before you agree. Not to defend them, not to excuse what was done, but to ask the quieter question, who is telling me this? What did they need me to believe, and what might I be missing? That question, small and simple as it sounds, is the beginning of real history.